really appreciate to see quite a few familiar faces from Australia and New Zealand, and some I don't know yet, but again, thank you for being here. So just as a lead into tonight's theme, I thought to offer a short, about a 15-minute guided meditation. So you might just take a few moments now to find yourself into a comfortable sitting position, one where the body can be relaxed and alert. So taking just a little bit of time to settle in to the body. You can notice the contact of the feet with the floor. And the contact of the sitting bones with the cushion or the chair. So as you feel into that support beneath you, you can let the weight of the body just settle a little more fully into that support, so that you can let go of any unnecessary holding or tension. And now you have that stable base. You can invite the spine, the torso, to become just a little straighter and taller. And then just checking that at the top of the spinal column, the weight of the head is balanced there, not leaning forward, but supported at the top of the spine, so that the muscles in the neck and the shoulders can relax. And the hands can just rest together on your lap or on your legs. So that the whole body now is expressing this balance of alertness and ease. And now that we've established the body as a kind of frame, within that, we can begin to connect a bit more closely to the experience of breathing. Not by narrowing the attention or focusing on the breath, but receiving the physical sensations of breathing in and breathing out, wherever these sensations are clearest for you. And you're not trying to change the breath in any way, whether it's long or short, deep or shallow, rough or smooth. Doesn't matter. Just settling back and receiving the experience of each in-breath and each out-breath. And even though we're establishing the breath as a kind of a home base, before too long, it's likely that you'll notice the attention has moved away from the breath. Quite likely into some kind of thinking. So when you recognize this, you can silently know or note thinking. thinking, thinking. And then gently bring your attention back to the body. And to notice if this thinking has had any effect on the body. Perhaps some kind of tension, a slight frown, or the small muscles around the eyes becoming a little tense, or a very faint clenching in the jaw. Perhaps the shoulders raising just a millimeter or two. So if you do happen to notice that kind of slight tension in the body as a result of thinking, just inviting it to soften, to release, to relax. And then re-establish the awareness on the experience of breathing. Simply knowing, breathing in and breathing out. And then again, perhaps quite quickly, you might notice that the attention has got caught up in some kind of thinking, some kind of thought pattern. Might feel somewhat familiar, something recurrent. So again, you just gently note thinking, thinking, if thinking is present. And if it does feel like a familiar thought pattern, see if you can notice what type of thinking is calling your attention. Not over analyzing or overthinking, but simply knowing, oh, planning. Planning is like this. Or fantasizing, daydreaming is like this. Rehearsing or worrying is like this. So without trying to get rid of whatever mental activity might be present, we're just making space for it, knowing it exactly as it is. But if we tend to get lost in that thinking, when we recognize that, we can come back to the home base of the breath, re-establishing mindfulness on the simple knowing of breathing in and breathing out. And then if at some point we recognize another pattern of thinking. We notice it. We note it. Planning, wondering, worrying. And it's possible that as you do this, you might start to recognize some quite recurrent thought patterns, quite familiar forms of thinking. And if this is true for you, you might bring your awareness a little further down into the body. To notice if there are any emotions underneath that thinking. Perhaps there's a trace of anxiety, or a pulse of self-judgment. Maybe a flicker of irritation or frustration. So just tuning in and noticing any mental activity, and if perhaps there are also some underlying emotions or feelings beneath the thought patterns. Not trying to get rid of them, but also not feeding them. Simply making space and allowing them to be there. And as you let go of getting caught up in or fighting with what's happening in the heart and the mind, as you simply allow and make space for any mental activity that happens to be present. You might begin to notice that in this space, more skillful qualities of mind have room to emerge. So as we come towards the close of our meditation, you might just notice, is there perhaps just a little more ease? Just a little more steadiness? Perhaps a little more acceptance, openness, warmth or kindness. Not manufacturing anything, but just checking and noticing any skillful qualities that might be in the mind right now. With the aspiration that whatever benefits have come from this time of meditating, that they might be a contribution to the welfare, the happiness, and the freedom of all beings everywhere. Okay, so thank you again for being here with me this morning. See, these Zoom calls can be very disorienting. Thank you for being here with me this evening, my time. I'm happy to be joining you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, on land that is cared for by the Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei people. And each of you likewise located in different parts of Australia, perhaps other parts of the world. You're all in your specific environments that have their own history, legacy, culture, and perhaps also a connection with the indigenous people. So just taking a moment internally to acknowledge the land, the environment that each of us is located on. And all the different people, the beings that we share it with. And perhaps with that aspiration to treat our environment well and to minimize the harm that we cause as best we can. So this theme of minimizing harm, of course, also includes minimizing the harm that we do to we ourselves. And while most of us, I think, don't consciously intend to harm ourselves physically, many of us struggle with ways of thinking and with emotional patterns that can be quite painful at times. So I've experienced this in my own practice and also with working with many people in different parts of the world, as Bronwyn mentioned. I teach quite a lot in Australia, New Zealand, the US, and sometimes the UK and Europe. And what's surprising to me is to see just how common it is across all those different countries, cultures, communities, how many people have a sense of really battling with, being at war with their own minds, really struggling with all kinds of afflictive thoughts and emotions that at times seem to make all of this Buddhist talk about ease and happiness and peace and freedom feel like some kind of cruel joke. So in spite of that, for many people, it's that same sense of inner struggle that launches us into meditating in the first place. So sometimes we come with a vague hope that we might be able to somehow get rid of that relentless stream of thinking that seems to torment us from the minute we wake up, sometimes all the way through until we go to bed at night, and then sometimes also through the night too. So we come to meditation with the hope that it'll somehow as people sometimes say, I just want my mind to shut up. But often what happens when we sit down in silence and try to meditate is not only does that thinking not go away, it can seem to get even louder and more insistent. Does that feel true for any of you here? Seems like some of you recognize that syndrome. And if we're a beginner, quite often people at this point tell themselves either that meditation doesn't work or that they can't do it. And it's tragic to me how often I hear people say things like, well, I can't meditate because my mind just doesn't stop thinking. So I wanted to talk about this tonight because this is such a common misperception of what meditation is about. And while it's true that in some types of meditation, not thinking might be the goal, this is not true of insight or Vipassana meditation. Fortunately for us, insight practice is not about getting the mind to stop thinking. Because as I'm sure you all know, trying to force the mind to stop not only doesn't work, it usually just creates a whole pile of extra stress and aversion on top of whatever we were already trying to deal with. So to be clear, in insight meditation, we're training ourselves to develop a wise relationship to it, so that ultimately we are able to free ourselves from those afflictive states. Now, having said that, it's not surprising that many people do have this unconscious belief that meditation is about not thinking, because at least in terms of mainstream media, meditation is being used to sell everything these days, from margarine to life insurance. And when meditation is presented in those contexts, it's often portrayed, usually, as being about a young, blonde, attractive woman sitting in a lotus position with her hands like this, and this sort of beatific, blissful smile on her face, and the implication that there's not a thought passing through her mind. So that stereotype, that is the popular assumption about what meditation is. It's about calming the body, getting rid of thoughts, somehow transcending, escaping from the world. And even very experienced meditators can have some unconscious belief that real meditation is what happens when the mind stops thinking. And unfortunately, this often gets reinforced by the way we're instructed into insight meditation, whether that's in meditation groups or on retreat. The beginning instructions usually sound something like this: sit down, pay attention to the breath, and when the mind wanders, come back to the breath. Has everyone had instruction of that kind? Pretty standard. Just keep coming back to the breath, back to the breath, back to the breath every time the mind wanders. So if we hear those beginning instructions repeated a lot, it can set up the belief that, okay, if my mind's not with the breath, and if it's about thinking, then it's definitely not really meditating. And this is partly because what is not often made explicit is the purpose of those beginning instructions. We use the breath as a kind of an anchor or a home base to help steady the mindfulness, stabilize the awareness, just enough so that we can then stay present and mindful with every other aspect of our experience too, not just the breath, but physical sensations anywhere in the body, sounds, and also all types of mental activity, including thoughts, emotions, moods, and mind states. So, although at first, in terms of the training, we make a distinction between the breath and the rest of our experience, in reality, we're always working with the mind. Because how do we know whether we're being mindful of the breath or not, apart from by paying attention with the mind? And even though we might tell ourselves, okay, now I'm doing mindfulness of breathing, in actual practice, how long does your attention stay there? So just based on the meditation we did a few minutes ago, if you were to look back at that, what percentage of time were you actually present with the breathing? Probably flickering on for a few nanoseconds and then gone, maybe coming back for another nanosecond and then gone. This is normal and natural. And usually when it moves away, it moves into some kind of thinking. And in the Buddha's teachings, he classified the mind as just another sense organ. So just as the eyes see and the ears hear, the mind thinks. It's just naturally what it does. So in some ways, mindfulness of breathing is almost a kind of a setup, because even though we're supposed to be paying attention to the breath, our thinking doesn't just conveniently stop. So sometimes I think we should more accurately call this practice mindfulness of breathing and thinking, because for most people, that's actually what's going on a lot of the time. And so we want to emphasize that this is normal and natural. And it's only a problem if we get into a struggle with that experience and try to control our mental activity and make it stop. And doing this usually just adds all kinds of other unskillful mental states, such as self-judgment and frustration and doubt and so on. So the purpose of insight meditation is to strengthen our awareness, to be able to be present with every aspect of our experience, what's happening in the body, what's happening in the heart, what's happening in the mind. So that with training, we can recognize how these afflictive mental states come up and how to let them release so that we can shift into more ease, happiness, peace, and freedom. So I chose the title of tonight's talk, Befriending the Mind, to try to normalize that working with difficult thoughts and emotions is not a problem. It's actually the path to freedom. Because when we can bring awareness to the mind itself and get some clarity, some insight about what's going on there, then we can begin to change those ingrained habit patterns. So to use a computer analogy, it's like we're rewriting our mental software, or perhaps even uninstalling some of those apps that are not so helpful, and instead installing new mind states, beneficial mind states, that over time change the default setting of our hearts and minds. So this is a process I'm calling befriending the mind. And this process is woven throughout the Buddha's teachings. So some of you know the Dhammapada, the collection of short sayings, and in the very first opening lines, the Buddha is reported to have said, "With our thoughts, we make the world. With our thoughts, we make the world." And I think most of us can understand the truth of that our thoughts, our emotions, our moods, our mind states have a powerful impact on how we experience our lives. However, practicing mindfulness of the mind, particularly thinking and emotions, is much easier said than done. Unlike the body, our mental activity happens so fast. Often we don't even realize what's been going on until we find ourselves in the middle of a painful conflict, or perhaps some kind of intense interpersonal drama, or maybe a 24-hour Netflix binge. And then we go, oh, what happened? So in the beginning, mindfulness of the mind often involves what I jokingly call post-mortem mindfulness, which is when we have to go back and look at, okay, what happened there after the fact, and try to identify what was that chain reaction that triggered that afflictive reaction that proliferated into some kind of mental storm. So as we get clearer, even if it's after the fact, that's still useful information, because hopefully the next time the mind starts going down that similar track, we catch it a little bit earlier, a bit earlier, a bit earlier, a bit earlier, until eventually that same trigger doesn't have any effect at all, or perhaps even has the opposite effect, and starts to bring up skillful mind states instead, such as kindness and compassion and appreciation and equanimity. So one challenge in trying to befriend the mind is just the speed of thinking. The second challenge in relation to our thoughts is that unless we have some mindfulness training, most people tend to take their thoughts and emotions very personally and to believe them to be true, to be real, to be mine, to be who I am. So we create a whole identity out of our mental activity. And we tell ourselves, I'm so angry, or I'm so depressed, or I'm so bored, or I'm such a failure, and so on. So without some Dharma understanding, most of us tend to take our thoughts and emotions far too seriously. But even if we do have some Dharma understanding, for all of us, I think there are patterns of thinking that do get their hooks into us. I don't know if you've had this experience, perhaps on retreat when we're in more supportive conditions. And there might be those times when we can just see thoughts arising, staying for a while, passing away, more thoughts coming and going. And then in that passing parade of mental activity, suddenly one jumps out of us and it's like, yep, that one's me, that's mine, that's who I am. And we've sort of taken the bait, it's got its hook into us. And for some reason, that one thought is the one that we tend to believe. And you might have had that experience even in daily life of perhaps just going about your day, feeling relatively at ease. And then some kind of thought comes in, seemingly out of nowhere, just a random negative thought. And it catches us. And it feels like the whole world shifts and we get triggered into this whole state of painful, unpleasant emotions, sometimes for hours, maybe even days, just because of firings of neurons in the brain. As our mindfulness gets stronger, though, we start to recognize that thoughts are just thoughts. And in and of themselves, they don't actually have that much power. They're just tiny pulses of electrical activity in the brain. And the only power they have is what we give to them. So the more solid we take them to be, the more we believe them, the more seriously we take them, to that extent they cause stress and distress. The opposite is also true. The more we can know our thoughts as just thoughts, the more freedom we have to choose which ones we respond to and which ones we just allow to pass on through. So challenging thoughts and mind states are a normal, expected part of the practice. And we don't have to slog our way through all of them for decades before we can get any benefit from this practice. They're actually fuel for the practice, because as we learn how to meet these painful states with mindfulness and with kindness, little by little, the unskillful states release, and in their place, the skillful ones have more room to grow. As I'm sure you know in your own experience, though, when we do get caught up in some kind of afflictive mind state, it's not always easy to say, well, this is fine, this is just a practice naturally unfolding. Instead, what often gets in the way are these very deeply conditioned habits of mind, painful thoughts that sometimes seem so familiar, seem so real, so true, so just who I am. So I wanted to focus now on just one specific type of afflictive thought pattern, partly because it's so common that it's pretty much universal. And that's the afflictive mental pattern known as comparing mind. So comparing mind is that tendency to assess ourselves in relation to other people as being either better than, worse than, or equal to. And in the Buddha's teachings, this is known as mana. And the symptoms are constantly being aware of what other people are doing, hyper aware of how we're doing by comparison. And often there's an inner monologue about how well or how badly we are doing relative to those other people. And this phenomenon of comparing mind shows up pretty much wherever there are other people. So even right now, you might be thinking, oh, well, I'm listening intently and they don't seem like they're listening very intently, or I'm not listening well enough, or, this is burble in the background. Sounds like some of you also recognize that. Wherever there are other people, comparing mind pops up. So in our families, our workplaces, our communities, our neighborhoods, our sanghas. And as I said, the Buddha recognized this all the way back in his own day. So this does feel to be a universal human experience. And the term that he used, mana, is usually translated into English as conceit. But in English, this can be confusing because in English, the word conceit usually refers to that tendency to think of ourselves as superior to other people. But in the Buddha's understanding, thinking oneself inferior to others is also equally a form of conceit. And actually, even thinking ourselves equal to others is a form of conceit in his understanding. So perhaps the English word conceiving rather than conceit might be more accurate, because it's pointing to this sense of us doing something with our minds. We're constructing or concocting or conceptualizing a distorted perception of ourselves and others. So I think most of us would probably recognize that thinking ourselves superior to others is problematic, unskillful. But when it comes to the opposite form of conceit, of thinking ourselves inferior, it seems to be pretty common not to recognize that as also problematic. And I honestly don't know what's going on in our societies, but it's been quite confronting for me to see just how many people have this deeply held belief, sense of themselves as inferior, of not having enough, of not being good enough, of being inadequate, unlovable, fundamentally flawed. And this basic misperception stops us from seeing clearly. It keeps us locked in this small sense of me, permanently isolated and disconnected from other people around us. And this was true for me early on in my practice, before I started practicing. And I struggled with it for many years, thinking that it was unique to me. I thought it was due to my specific family and social conditioning. And I also believed that by comparison, everyone else was totally together, fundamentally well-balanced, living blissfully free of even the slightest trace of neurosis. And it was only when I started to be in the teaching role that I started to recognize how many people have similar struggles and how common this sense of inferiority actually is. So just to give a real life example, a few years ago now, I taught a series of classes that were exploring these afflictive mental states, particularly focusing on anxiety and fear. And I think some of you were in those classes. And so as an entry into the first class, just to get to know the terrain a bit, I invited everyone just to write 2 lists. One, a list of anxieties that came up often in daily life. And then one, a list of anxieties in relation to Dharma practice. And then at the end of the class, I collected the lists, so they were anonymous, and I typed up what everybody had written so I could share it with the whole group. So if you'd asked me beforehand what kind of anxieties will people come up with, I would have had a pretty good idea. But still, when I saw the list and typed it up, it was poignant, even painful, to see these same themes coming up over and over again. So that single phrase, quote, not good enough, just that appeared many, many times. And then there were many variations of that phrase: not having enough money, not being smart enough, not working hard enough. And then the second major theme was around rejection and abandonment, not belonging. So fear of failure, fear that people won't like me for who I am, fear of being alone, fear of being found out as a fraud. So maybe some of you recognize some of those thought patterns. And what was striking to me was that this was a self-selected group of people who were interested in Dharma, who were interested in understanding themselves, and who were oriented to practicing wisdom and compassion. And even so, many people had this deep sense of unworthiness, fear of rejection. So I just offer that to share how common this sense of comparing mind and inadequacy is. And because at times it can be so strong, usually we need to work with both of the two wings to awakening. So as many of you know, these two wings are wisdom and compassion. And in previous talks here, I've already talked quite a bit about compassion. So tonight I'm going to focus more on the wisdom wing. So wisdom in terms of insight helps us to see clearly the truth that everything is constantly changing. Nothing can give us lasting satisfaction, and there's no fixed permanent entity at the center of all of this experience that I can call myself. So some of you will have recognized there what are known as the 3 marks of existence, or the 3 universal characteristics that the Buddha recognized as being true of everything we experience. So to use the Pali terms for those of you who know them, anicca, everything is impermanent. Dukkha, everything is unsatisfactory. And anatta, not self, without a solid core essence at the center of it all. So to use slightly different language, these 3 point to the truth that everything is impermanent, imperfect, and impersonal. And in insight practice, the more deeply we can see into these 3 characteristics, the more powerfully they support ease and happiness and peace and freedom. So just to get a sense of how that might work in relation to afflictive mind states. Impermanence. When we're in the grip of one of those powerfully painful mental patterns, even just intellectually reminding ourselves of the truth of change. So we don't have to struggle to avoid it or get rid of it. We might just write it out, knowing this too shall pass. This too shall pass. Because of the truth of change, at some point, that painful state will disappear. Not necessarily in the time frame we would like, but at some point it will subside. And we don't have to micromanage it necessarily or get caught in struggling to get rid of it. Often, though, we do the opposite. We collapse into the afflictive state and unconsciously make it more solid and more permanent than it actually is by the way we talk about it in our own inner dialogue. So for me, this was quite a turning point in my practice, because as I think you all know, ethics is really the foundation of this whole practice. And we make a commitment to avoid harming through our actions and through our speech. So one of the training precepts is the commitment to not lie or to not speak harshly. And at some point I realized if I'm serious about that training, that has to include my inner language as well. And I needed to start applying the same standards of kindness and honesty to my inner speech as to what I said outside. And it was pretty shocking when I started looking and hearing some of the words that I used in relation to myself. And as I started to pay more attention, I started to also recognize how often those statements that I was making to myself were distorting reality. And often they involve what psychologists call eternalizing statements. So these are statements that use words like always, never, and so on. Like, I'm always anxious. I never experience any calm. I'm constantly getting it wrong. So words like always and never are symptoms of absolutist thinking. And that's a style of thinking that psychologists recognize is often linked to anxiety and depression. And in Buddhist terms, this thinking is unhealthy because it reinforces the delusion of permanence. So if you do happen to notice this tendency to tell yourself, use this absolutist language, you might just play with it and see if you can find instead language that's a bit more nuanced, a bit more factually true. So instead of saying, I'm always anxious, just to reframe it as, I have a tendency to feel anxious in certain circumstances. Or instead of, I never experience any calm, I haven't yet had much experience of calm in my meditation practice. Or I'm constantly getting it wrong. I sometimes feel that my practice isn't going as well as it could. Do you hear the difference? In one, it makes it solid, fixed, permanent, and the other, there's a bit more room to play. So sometimes when I suggest this to people and I say, well, are you really always anxious? They try to convince me that I'm wrong, and that actually for them, their painful patterns have always been there, always will be, forever and ever. Amen. So sometimes I ask people to really check, to counter that sense that it's permanent and solid, to think of whatever that state is on a scale of 0 to 10. So again, using anxiety as an example, if 10 is the most extreme panic attack and 0 is total calm, throughout the day, you might just notice. Are you always at a 10? Probably not. You might not always be at 0 either, but generally speaking, for most people, this is coming and going, sometimes more activated, sometimes less. So it's not, I'm always anxious, the way we might tell ourselves. And when we do this, we can start to notice those times when there's less anxiety. And this is really important because of the mind's inbuilt negativity bias. We tend to pay a lot more attention to the afflictive states and to not even recognize when those states are absent, or in their place, there are actually skillful states. So the more we can keep tuning to when we're not anxious, the more we let in that relative ease or calm, the more we can allow that to start to be our default setting instead of the agitation. So impermanence, seeing the changing nature of these mind states. And then the second of the 3 characteristics is dukkha, unsatisfactoriness, the truth of imperfection. And just to be able to acknowledge that things aren't always perfect, in a way, is going against so much of our mainstream conditioning. Most of us spend a lot of time to try to make everything just the way we want it, make it better, even perfect. So we get caught in really trying to control our external circumstances, and at times other people too, trying to make things and situations and people exactly the way we want them to be. And often this is driven by the unconscious assumption that if I can just do X or Y or Z, then everything will be okay, and then I'll be happy. But in spite of that effort, not many of us can say that we found that lasting happiness that we keep hoping for. And now that's not to say that there aren't moments of happiness, sometimes many moments of very intense happiness. But because of the truth of impermanence, they don't last. And so living in alignment with the truth of unsatisfactoriness gives us a little bit more space, a bit of relief from that drive to keep trying to improve ourselves. It can be very easy to approach this whole Dharma practice as a giant self-improvement project, which is actually driven by aversion. So acknowledging the truth of dukkha gives us a little bit more space. It doesn't mean just giving up completely, though. No, well, it's all dukkha, so why bother? That would not be true acceptance. Instead, it's an invitation to look non-judgmentally at our underlying motivations, so we can discern what we can change and what we can't. So because of the truth of impermanence too, at times we are susceptible to these difficult mind states, so we don't want to judge ourselves. As far as I know, there's very few people who are completely, utterly immune from them. And even though we might understand this in theory, most of us tend to take our own afflictive mind states pretty personally, as I mentioned earlier, to see them as unique to us, our unique neuroses. But again, in terms of wisdom, of insight, this is a serious distortion of the truth. So now we come to the third of these three characteristics, which is anatta, or not self. And that's the understanding that everything we experience is an impersonal process. It's not happening to a fixed, solid, permanent entity who dwells at the center of the universe, even though it often feels like that. And again, this is not so easy to understand. But just to notice what happens when we don't live in alignment with not self, the more we identify with our experience, the more personally we take it, the more we make it mine, who I am, the more we suffer. And again, we can see this in our inner language, how we talk to ourselves, how often we do take ownership of these fleeting moods and emotions and mind states and turn them into an identity. So we tell ourselves, well, I'm just an angry type, or I'm a victim of workplace bullying, or I'm a highly realized meditator. Now, every one of those statements might have some partial truth, but when they're expressed that way so solidly, they become prisons. They keep us stuck in relating to the world in just one way. And because of the truth of impermanence, we have to keep shoring up those identities and reinforcing them and protecting them to try and make them stable in an unstable world, which of course adds a whole pile of extra stress to the whole thing. So we want to pay attention again to this kind of self-reinforcing language. And again, we can play with those inner statements to help soften that identification. So instead of, for example, saying, I'm an angry type, we might say, under certain conditions, I have a tendency to experience irritation or to get frustrated. Or instead of saying, I'm a victim of workplace bullying, eventually it might become, in a highly toxic work environment, I found it hard to stand up for myself. So we're not negating the truth of our experience, we're just looking at how we're presenting it even to ourselves. So we're reducing that tendency to collapse our whole identity into whatever that mental state might be. And we're using more nuanced language that's closer to the truth of anicca and dukkha and anatta. So those are just a few ways we can use the wisdom of insight to help reduce the strength of those afflictive patterns. Even so, there are times when they do get their hooks into us, and then we might need to bring in the compassion wing for a while, particularly in the form of self-compassion. So I'm not going to go into this in detail because I'm aware of the time tonight. But just to say that with self-compassion, we're invited to acknowledge the distress of those afflictive thought patterns and to orient to the release of the pain, even if it's just as an imaginative exercise. So, for example, the set of phrases that I use for compassion practice are, I'm aware of this pain. I care about this pain. May this pain release. And may I know peace. So that's just an invitation when we're in the distress of a difficult state to see, can we bring awareness to it? I'm aware of this pain. And to see, can we care about it? I care about this pain. And then to see if we can imagine being beyond it. May this pain release. And may I know peace. So there's a whole lot more that could be said about all of this. But as an act of compassion, I'm going to bring the talk to a close now, because I'd like to hear from any of you how you might be experiencing this, how you might have worked with these afflictive mind states. But if compassion and self-compassion is of interest, you might look at some of the previous talks that I've given here at the Buddhist Library or on the Dharma Seed website. There are plenty of talks and guided meditations there. Okay, so thank you for your kind attention.